All right, a big thank you one more time to John Lettieri, Dr. Scott Winship, Dr. Richard Reeves, and Dr. Caroline Ratcliffe. We're going to transition a little bit from the economic to the political, but still talk about the economics because that's what we do here today. And we've got a really terrific group of people to talk about it. It spans ideological spectrum, spans different expertise within politics and economics. We've got 4 really amazing people moderated by perhaps the moderator with more experience than Steve Clemons, Greg Ip, the terrific chief economics commentator from the Wall Street Journal. He'll be joined on stage with friends of ours, and I think what will make for a very punchy panel. We've got Dr. Jared Bernstein, former chief economist to Vice President Joe Biden, currently a senior... And we've got a Joe Biden fan in the audience. And currently the senior fellow to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, also the co-chair of the Economic Advisory Board for EIG, full disclosure. Kristen Soltys Anderson, co-founder of Echelon Insights, one of the best pollsters in the business, who has a podcast called The Pollsters, and an expert in particular on insights and viewpoints of millennials. We have sitting next to her, Dr. Doug Holtz-Eakin, I would argue a legend in this town, the president of the American Action Forum, the former chief economist for the CEA, the former director of the Congressional Budget Office, someone well known for his economic views. And sitting next to him, a good friend of mine, Crystal Ball, the president of the People's House Project, which is a fascinating attempt at mobilizing and energizing and empowering working class candidates for Congress around the country. Also the host of a brand new show on Hill TV and a former co-host on MSNBC. A big round of applause for our next panel.
Well, thank you very much. I love reading about economic history, and I've been buried in Doug Irwin's amazing history of American trade policy for the last few weeks. And one of the fascinating things is the extent to which economic issues like tariffs divided the country for its first 100 years. And I feel like, that was all kind of a dry run for where we are today. And back then, it was Republicans were the party of protectionism, and the Democrats were the party of free trade. So, Doug, that brings me to my first question, which is, I have always thought of the Republican Party on the economic plane as it was the pro-business party, the free trade party, the party of small government. Is it still?
Not entirely. It's never been a monolith. I mean, the Republican Party's always had within it dissenting views. I remember distinctly how hard it was in 2001 to get Trade Promotion Authority for then President George W. Bush, and that was in a Republican-controlled House. So the schisms have always been there. There's no question about it. But the dominant bloc was, in fact, as you described it, and we've just seen that really melt away in the past 15 years. It's been a dramatic shift. I think it happened mostly during the financial crisis. You could see it when I was on the campaign trail with John McCain. You'd begin to see it shifting there. Conventional proposals like corporate tax cuts that he had really didn't excite people in the way that they would have in previous years, previous elections.
And why did that happen to the Republican Party? I mean, did that precede Trump, or did Trump cause it, or did it cause Trump?
I'm not going to answer any questions with Trump in them. There are a lot of things that happened. I mean, one of the big things that's happened is that the U.S., despite all the sort of rhetoric about it, has become more and more urbanized, and Democrats control urban areas. And as a result, Republicans had to start to appeal to people who were outside of those areas, and the issue sets were different. And so they started to sort of shift on the issue sets as well. We've seen that pretty steadily over the past few decades.
And Kristen, you see a lot of how these views and identities shift in the polling data. Tell me, how has the average or the typical median Republican voter changed in terms of how he or she thinks about what economic issues matter to him or her?
So I have a very profound memory from around the time of the financial crisis, or shortly thereafter. It was during the Occupy Wall Street moment. where a writer at the Washington Examiner, Tim Carney, he went and camped out with some of the Occupy Wall Street protesters. He himself, a kind of a Tea Party libertarian guy, just wanted to understand what's this movement all about. And he came back and he wrote a column where he says, you know, I think there's a lot more in common between the Tea Party and these Occupy Wall Street folks than you might imagine. Because both of them think that the marriage of big business and big government is not benefiting the little guy. And they have very different views about which half of that equation bears most of the blame. The Tea Party thinks it's mostly a big government problem. Occupy Wall Street thinks it's mostly a big business problem. But nonetheless, they believe that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can't get ahead anymore. And so maybe we need to reevaluate those rules. And I think that Donald Trump was able to tap into that frustration that a lot of Republican voters felt that, hey, I've been working hard and playing by the rules. I don't feel like I've been getting ahead. I don't feel like I've been getting my fair share. It's time for something new. And I think that reshaped the Republican Party to be less favorable toward free trade. If they didn't feel like it was giving them a good deal personally, then they were less motivated to have that be something they were going to vote in favor of. The other factor, which is something that Doug mentioned, is this kind of realignment of who is in the coalitions. An excellent book I would recommend to all of you is called The Lost Majority by Sean Trendy. It came out in 2013, I believe, right after the 2012 election. And if you have a book coming out called The Lost Majority that year, you think it's about Republicans losing their majority forever and ever because of demographics. But instead, he made the case that Democrats were at risk of losing the white working class over precisely some of these over a variety of issues. And that this was an opportunity available to Republicans. And Donald Trump took that opportunity and ran with it.
So Krista, that's a great segue to you, because I want to pick up on that point she said, the warning about the Democrats losing the white working class.
Yeah.
And I think we can say that if we look at the polling and exit poll data, they have lost the white working class. How much of a problem is that? And should that dictate where the Democratic Party puts its policy emphasis in coming elections?
So I look at this, I am a partisan and I work to get Democrats elected, in particular in this year, in these places where Democrats used to be strong and have lost ground. So we focus in particular on the South, on Appalachia, on the quote unquote Rust Belt that I call the industrial Midwest. I don't focus on policies that will help the white working class because I want Democrats to win. I think about candidates and policies who will help the multiracial working class of America, because that's what's going to make America okay. That's what's going to make America work. Do I think that Democrats should be fighting to win back the white working class? Do I think that they need to be listening to what this group has been trying to say for a while? And yes, are there racial attitudes there that the Republican Party has catered to and that Donald Trump has explicitly catered to? Yes. Are there also legitimate grievances? Grievances, by the way, that are in common across working class communities? Absolutely. So if we can figure out solutions that are going to actually help this group of people address the legitimate economic concerns that they have, which are consistent among all working class communities, and if we can put candidates forward, and I think this is an area where the Democratic Party has really failed, put candidates forward that have credibility with these group of individuals, then there is a shot to win back the white working class. I'll give you one example of a candidate that, full disclosure, I'm working with. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with Richard Ojeda. He's an Army veteran. He's running in southern West Virginia. And you talk about quote unquote Trump country. I mean, this is it. Donald Trump won his district by 50 points. Okay, his hometown, his county, 75% of voters chose Donald Trump. Richard Ojeda is leading in the polls right now. It's an open seat, and he is up by, depending on the poll, about 6 points on his opponent. It's not because he's moderated or he's, taken contrary to the National Party positions or he's trying to do any of those things. He is fully populist, progressive, particularly on economics, but he is so southern West Virginia, and his campaign is so southern West Virginia that people trust him. So I expect him to win in the fall in a place where Democrats shouldn't have any chance to win, where it is the sort of quintessential white working class American carnage kind of a district. And it's because he's speaking to that populist element, and he actually looks at his community with respect and pride, and they respond to that and they trust him. So to come back to your question, do I think that Democrats should focus on winning back the white working class? Yes, but not as some cynical political strategy, because it's the right thing to do to try to address the economic challenges that this nation's facing.
Jared, I want to come to you next. I mean, when I first got into the economic policy game, there was a breed of Democrat that we called the New Democrat. This was a Democrat who was still for redistribution, strong safety net, but in the context of fiscal rectitude and responsibility and globalization. You didn't stand in the way of change. You basically helped people cope with change. I don't think I hear that quite as much anymore. It seems like the energy is all someplace else. Am I wrong? What happened to New Democrats, and do those policy focuses still have a place in the Democratic Party?
I think so. I mean, I guess I have a quick question for you. So where would you put Barack Obama in that scale? Because I actually think that he's probably closer to that than not. It's just that, of course, he got hung up in a great recession and a financial crisis and so, that stuff. But would he fit under that rubric?
I would say he would be closer to it than Bernie Sanders, kind of like a continuum, wouldn't you say? Like it goes from Clinton to Obama to...
I'd say so.
I think so. I mean, he was, it brought in Wall Street folks and was friendly to business, and I would put it on that continuum as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, I mean, it's funny listening to Doug talk about how the Republicans are not a monolith and kind of maybe have some different frictions. I mean, think about the Democrats in that regard. I mean, when they say, I'm not a member of any organized party, I'm a Democrat.
Yeah.
That seems even more the case today. So listening to the conversation, I think it's probably not the case that sort of the New Democrat that you describe is gone. And in fact, some of the emphasis on this white working class strikes me as over-interpreting what happened, because at least as I understand it, I'm not the pollster that you are, that there are a lot of voters who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. So go figure. That sounds very situational to me. So I think that, here I'm probably riffing off of a little bit of what Crystal said, I think the thing that really has defined Democrats in the context of that's most germane in the context of our conversation, is that we were the party that really addressed people hurt by both market failures, discrimination, kind of left behind in a market economy that the other side argued would pull them along. And to some extent, the New Democrat, the Bill Clinton, Robert Root wing of the party, very much viewed that as consistent with their agenda, but largely for the poor. I think one of the things that's happening now is that more Democrats, and I hope this is true, are recognizing that you can't just think of yourself as a party that helps the poor, ignores the middle class, and taxes the wealthy. It's got to be. It has to be a more fulsome agenda, which involves not just targeting, in my language, the 20th or the 10th percentile wage, but also targeting the middle, the median wage, and in a pre-tax sense. So you have to help working people at the level of their paycheck. And I'm not sure if that's New Democrat. It's probably a little more Old Democrat, but that strikes me as the best target for the Democrats.
But when you see where the energy is, like if you look at the campaign, ideas of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she talks about Medicare for all. She talks about lifetime job guarantees. She has an economics degree and she knows how to use it. She talks about Gini coefficients, which I think is just wonderful. But I dare say
those are
that
always a winner.
that's right. Yeah. You had me at Gini coefficient. But I think that it's safe to say that these policy programs would not fit within a PAYGO 10-year budget window, right?
No kidding.
So,
well, I mean,
is that a problem for people like you, who used to actually care about stuff like that?
It's a great,
still do.
It's a great question, and to the extent that these things fit into PAYGO, that is. So when I heard the Bernie Sanders agenda, I thought, well, that's an agenda that's going to cost another 10% of GDP, which I think is correct. And same with what she was saying. So you can definitely convince yourself pretty quickly that that's not very realistic if you're going to pay for it. Now, I will say that there are a lot of Democrats who used to think more about fiscal rectitude who say, why do we always have to be the fiscally responsible party? Republicans spend hand over fist without any regard to fiscal rectitude, and then they win because they gave people a bunch of goodies. So there's some tension there. But I guess I would say that the agenda that she's espousing there is an aspirational one that's signaling to voters what I said in my first intervention, and again, where Crystal was kind of coming from, which is that there are a set of problems out there that the market hasn't solved for you and isn't going to solve for you. It certainly hasn't done so even at 4% unemployment. Ergo, we need to think creatively and robustly about policies that will help lift you up.
To echo a little bit of that, I mean, I think you're right to put it in the framing of aspirational, although I think these candidates are very serious about the scale of their ideas. But I think the reason this is where the energy is, and by the way, this is something Donald Trump did too, laid out big ideas that people saw as sort of aspirational and, you know, as the bumper stickers rather than practical policy solutions. But I think why you see people responding to those big ideas is they don't feel like the tinkering and the incrementalism is going to get them where they need to go. You know, if you look at the communities that are not participating in growth, even with the economy that we have now, even with low unemployment, the places that are still losing people, that are still losing jobs, that are dealing with drug epidemics and crime and other issues, they don't feel like a little tax cut here or a little, you know, minimum wage hike there is going to solve their problems. So when they see something that makes people here uncomfortable, and by here I mean this town, not necessarily in this room, they like that. They think, well, maybe that would be big enough to solve the problem. And I think to Jared's point, there seems like, and I was on the ground in West Virginia during the teacher strike, which, by the way, was an unbelievable moment. And what it really came down to, it wasn't partisan at all, it had nothing to do with Donald Trump. It was people saying, you know what, we've heard for too long that there's plenty of money to give away the store to whatever business wants whatever thing, but there's nothing left to just pay teachers enough to live and not have a second job. And we're done. We're calling BS. We're not going to take it anymore. I think that little microcosm of energy, which of course rippled across the country, speaks to the moment we're in where people see that they have been sold a bill of goods, that there's always enough to give away to other folks, but when it comes to them, I'm sorry, we're poor, there's no money left for you.
So Doug, I'm going to pull you in now because I heard the words tax cut. And the president, who I understand you won't answer a question with a certain person's name in it, so with the initials DJT, didn't just talk big, his Congress, his party delivered big.
Yeah.
Got a massive tax cut that with a 10-year cost of $1 to $1.5 trillion. And now this morning I read that Kevin Brady is wants to double down another $800-900 billion, including inflation indexing for capital gains. Is this the logical direction for the Republican Party to put its economic and political resources into, given the kinds of shifts that have been happening?
The truth is, I don't know. But there are a lot of things that I think have been really interesting about this conversation. So one of the things that's gone on, in my view, this is going to be a little bit harsh, I think, is there's an enormous amount of cynicism involved on both sides in the way they're treating the voter, which is we are going to use the two most powerful forces we know in politics, fear and anger. We're going to make you afraid of immigrants. We're going to make you angry at big businesses. We're going to incite you. And then we're going to make promises that could not possibly be fulfilled. And when I fail, you don't get to hold me accountable because no one could have done that and the Congress stopped me or whatever. It's a completely cynical approach to politics. And the reason I raise it is the traditional Republican approach, which you characterized as incrementalism, was we have these principles. We don't have constituencies, and we're not going to hand things out and incite them and get them together. We have small government, reliance on markets, a belief in individual and economic freedoms, and if we stick to those principles, we will better everyone over the long term, and that's what we're going to do. And so those things are really counterpoints at the moment, and it just jumps right out in the Trump campaign, who did that dramatically. The reason I raise it is the things that are going now are the traditional Republican things. They are taxes, regulatory policies, the economy's going real well, and the issue will be, will the voters look past the cynicism of the presentation and say, hey, that stuff actually is what finally got things going? And will that sort of shift this debate in a way that'll make it look like maybe the whole thing was a bit of an aberration and that the values were always really there?
Kristen, what do you think? Will deregulation and tax reform actually make an impression on Republican voters and deliver the goods that Doug's talking about?
I think for Republican voters, something like tax reform is kind of just table stakes. Like you did a thing. Congratulations, you passed a bill.
Oh, yeah, they don't care about that. They care about the economy, though.
Right, and so I just want to know, do I have more money in my paycheck? I'm glad that you did something positive.
Yeah.
What I have seen in focus groups is that deregulation is something that for base Republicans, their eyes light up on that, even more so than the tax cut, because for that's principles at work, that's getting big government out of the way. But it's the tax cuts themselves, it's what do they enable and what are they a part of? And when people feel like the economy is going well, they want to see more of that. This is why I think, to do a little bit of political punditry for a second, I think this election, in some ways, the parallels between this election and 2010 are bizarre and freakish. Somebody who is on their way to being a leader of one of the parties in Congress gets taken out in a primary by forces that are beyond their control. That a surprise election in a deep, in this case, red state you have a Democrat from Alabama in the Senate, just like you had Scott Brown from Massachusetts. I mean, all of these sort of bizarre universe parallels. The one thing that I think is different is that in 2010, a lot of voters were looking around. The Affordable Care Act had been popular when it was passed and became slightly less popular as you approached the midterms. The stimulus was never particularly popular with voters. And so you had voters going, I don't know that I like what's going on, and I'm okay voting for the other party because I would like to maybe pump the brakes on this a little bit. I might want a different direction. And the fact that the economy is doing relatively well, that the president's job approval is not great, but it's better when you ask people how do they think things are going on the economy, is the one big factor that I think makes this less likely to be the opposite version of 2010. It's the one thing Republicans have going for them.
Yes.
There was a time when Republicans would have been appalled at a president who basically called out companies and said, don't raise your prices, Pfizer, don't outsource your cars, Ford or General Motors. This president does it on a regular basis, and is that actually, and he gets cheered for it. You know, does that also speak to a shift in the way Republicans see the role of the government in the economy?
I think the idea that a large portion of the Republican coalition is deeply committed to the idea that government ought not have anything to do with business is fairly small. I think the coalition on the Republican side is pieced together of some folks who are there because of immigration, some folks who are there because of trade, some folks who are there because of national security. And so while there are some Republicans who, when they see the president sort of going on Twitter to browbeat a company over outsourcing jobs, thinks, I don't know that I like the idea of the President of the United States telling an individual company what they should or shouldn't do. An awful lot of people, I think the point that Crystal made earlier, have said, look, things haven't been working all along, so I am willing to accept something that looks very different and very unconventional, because gosh, I don't think what we were doing before worked.
I mean, it's really interesting because, again, there was always this divide. Like inside the Republican Party, all my adult life, there's the small business guys. They hated Pfizer from the moment they were born. And there's the sort of pro-market people like myself who don't have any particular affection for any business but think it's the best way to help Americans. Then there was genuinely the big business guys. The latter group is in complete disarray at the moment. And so they have no way to stand up to this president. And there's also the political phenomenon, which is people find a way to excuse Donald J. Trump. They did it during the campaign. They would say, I don't like the way he says this, but he's not an average politician. And they're doing the same thing. He's still getting people saying, I don't like that, but letting him go. And the question is, will that change?
Well, and I think part of what this moment has revealed is, for a while we had this idea that the constituency that was large and out there and unspoken to were the cultural, liberal, fiscal conservatives, right? That was sort of like the no labels model. Well, what I think the Trump phenomenon and the shift in the Republican Party has really revealed is that there was this massive contingent of really, fiscal liberals in a way, who are more cultural conservatives, who no one was speaking to. I mean, the traditional Republican conservative fiscal approach has a relatively, compared to the more sort of progressive or liberal model, has a comparatively small base.
Yeah,
But Republicans were, and they're all here, right?
Yeah.
But Republicans were very successful at signaling on cultural issues to pull people even though those people really weren't on board with cuts to Social Security or cuts to Medicare or keeping the minimum wage low and those sorts of things. So when you had someone who said, I'm going to be tough on immigration, I'm going to put in the Supreme Court justices that you want to see, and I'm going to lift minimum wage, I'm going to give everybody health care, I'm not going to cut Social Security, all things that the president said on the campaign trail, there were a lot of people out there that were like, finally, this is my guy.
So one of the interesting trends that you've seen in recent years is that people are looking at the things that drive voters, believe that they're sorting themselves less along a traditional left to right axis and now more along a globalist nationalist axis. And you see this in other countries like in Brexit in Eastern Europe and so forth. And globalists, they think of themselves as they're open-minded, they're cosmopolitan, they generally are comfortable with immigration, they're comfortable with free trade. Nationalists think of themselves as communitarian, borders are important, national identity is important. And when I look at some of the polling data, it's kind of interesting. You see that on free trade, which is an easy way to look at this, you've seen support among Democrats go up while it's gone down among Republicans. And so my question to all four of you is, are we seeing the American electorate start to sort itself out along this globalist versus nationalist axis as well? And if so, is the Democratic Party going to become the party of the globalists, the free traders?
I mean, for a long time, Democrats, I think this is not widely appreciated, actually voted fairly consistently, especially in the House, as a bloc against kind of unfettered free trade. The idea was that if you followed Sandy Levin, a Rosa DeLauro, a lot of Democrats who've been around for a while and worked on these issues all the way back to NAFTA, you'll find folks who recognize that while trade has upsides, it also has downsides. And I think that's really been probably the profound divider that gets that underlies the dynamics you're describing, Greg, and that's the notion that Donald Trump vanquished all these deep-pocketed Republicans in their primary because he was really the only one, at least on this globalization point. I mean, there are many, many other factors involved, but at least on this point, he was the one who stood up and said, globalization has downsides, trade has hurt you, China has hurt you. From my perspective, as someone who's been studying international trade for decades, maybe vastly exaggerated in certain ways, and I certainly think the current policies to ameliorate this from the Trump administration are going to backfire. That said, the recognition that significant swaths of people in their community have been hurt by international trade, especially imbalanced trade with countries that pay their workers far less than we do, but have really comparable productivity, is a reality now that Democrats have to deal with if they're going to get anywhere. So it's hard for me to imagine someone running for office and saying, I'm a globalist, open up the borders and bring in the immigration. I think I think what's really tough is how Democrats are going to weave this nationalist line into a much more into an agenda that has to be more inclusive if we're going to get anywhere.
I don't know that I would say that it's realigning along a globalist nationalist axis. The way that I've been thinking about this, and I'm stealing it from Ron Brownstein, who's written a lot about this, is that it's the coalition of transformation and the coalition of restoration. So restoration, making something great again. Where have you heard that before? The idea that things used to be great, the economy, I used to be able to work a job 9 to 5, it would give me enough of a paycheck to support my family, maybe my spouse didn't have to work and we could raise our 2.3 kids and our dog and our house with a white picket fence and everything was great. And that's not America that we live in anymore, and that's a problem, and therefore this guy who says he's going to make us great again, he'll take us to economic policies that can restore that. On the flip side is the coalition of transformation that says, look, economics, culture, technology, this is all changing very quickly. The way we define family is changing quickly. The way we structure our careers is changing very quickly. The way we communicate is changing quickly. And these are all on balance pretty good things. And so let's ride with these trends. Let's make these trends work for us. And let's have economic policies that have adapted to harness this new era. And I think that is what Republicans have moved toward, this coalition of restoration. Let's go grab the things that we used to do that were good and do them again. And Democrats, I think the coalition, especially from communities of color, young people, are part of this coalition of transformation that are saying, I don't want to go back. Let's have policies that are built for the future. And it's why I think Republicans are winning politically in the short term, but have long-term
I
challenges
just want
they
to make
have not grappled
a very
with.
quick point about this, because I know we're getting to the politics of, I think that's a great framing, but the politics of restoration ultimately, it seems to me, won't work if you don't restore anything. And I think the problem with Trump's agenda, so even now at 4% unemployment, we have middle worker wages growing at the rate of inflation. So enough people aren't getting ahead even at low unemployment. I think the tax cut was very misguided. I think the trade policy is extremely, so the likelihood that Trump will have to run on a restoration agenda that didn't deliver strikes me as high and problematic.
I want to just quickly share an anecdote. Yesterday I spoke to the head of an aluminum mill. He's opening a great big new aluminum mill in Ashland, Kentucky. Huge fan of the president's tariffs and so on. He said, we're going to create 600 permanent good paying jobs. And I said, how many jobs will there be 10 years from now? He said, 500. I said, why? AI, automation, we don't need as many workers. So I think there, from somebody that supports the president's agenda, I think identifying the tensions. Doug, Crystal, final thoughts? Anything on this transformation?
I mean, here's one thing I would say to this. I think, and you know, some people on the panel in the room may disagree, but I think Donald Trump was totally wrong, but he had an answer. He had a villain and an answer for why things aren't going well for you. It's essentially, you know, a white nationalist answer. If we put you back on top, if we close down the borders from the brown people, you're going to be back where you were. And that's a terrible answer, and it's wrong, but it was an answer. I don't think the Democratic Party has an answer right now.
That's fair.
We don't have an answer. We have some things, we have some policies, we're going to lift your wage here, but what is causing the situation you're in, and what are we going to do about it? I don't think that we can say that.
We're all out of time. Thanks very much for a really good discussion, all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah.